Insomniac's first Spider-Man game launched in 2018. It featured awesome web swinging that made getting from place to place a thrill, smooth, context-sensitive combat with top-class cinematic presentation, and an endearing, emotional ride of a story that was so full of character and so good that I refer to the game as the best of the Spider-Man films. And it had some piss-poor superfluous content that saw you chasing pigeons, enduring terrible stealth missions, and cursing at the game. The bad didn't cancel out the good, and overall, I loved it. A lot has happened with Insomniac since then. They're a Sony studio now, and with Spider-Man and Ratchet & Clank, they've really cemented themselves as a critical pillar for PlayStation. Spider-Man Miles Morales released as a standalone expansion. The combat was refined, the content less bloated, the story once again endearing, and our second Spider-Man is now fully established and ready to co-star in this sequel. And of course, they ruined Spider-Man's face, replacing the original model with a Wish.com Tom Holland. Nonetheless, the previous Spider-Man games are fan favourites held in really high esteem. Spider-Man 2 steps in from this strong legacy and expectations are high. You could say there's a great responsibility here, and with great responsibility comes great... No wait, I don't think it works that way around. Whatever, let's get on with the review. Spider-Man 2 sees you playing through some incredible set pieces. It features smooth, action-packed, exciting gameplay, and a story that grips harder than any of the heroes and villains in the game, though it doesn't quite match the emotional crescendo of Spider-Man 2018. And it's a real technical spectacle that showcases what current consoles can do. It hits right on so many levels. When Spider-Man 2 is in full swing, pun intended but quite regrettable, when you're in the throes of the campaign fighting against impossible odds amidst awesome scenes of chaos and heroism, the game is stunningly good. It marries cinema and gameplay in such a way that it feels accomplished in both. It's so common in games for cinematic presentation and gameplay to encroach on each other. Spider-Man isn't totally immune to that, but overall it delivers exceptionally well on both fronts. However, much like its predecessor, there's quite a lot of padding around those good bits, and a lot of that padding tastes bad if you eat it. Spider-Man 2 may be built on top of the 2018 game, but it's definitely built to leverage the best of the PlayStation 5, and it stands as a showcase for what that console can do. It exploits every signature feature of the hardware, usually in ways that really benefit the experience, even for players that don't really care what's under the hood. Spider-Man 2018 was renowned for its joyful traversal, swinging around New York City at satisfying speeds. You get twice the New York to explore now, and the Spider-Men boys burst through the speed limits of the first game to cover their expanded playground at a pace that would have choked the mechanical hard drive and crossed the old processor in the PlayStation 4. The city is also vastly more populated at the ground level, should you ever accidentally find yourself down there, with far more cars and pedestrians to make New York look more alive. And that more dense population isn't limited to pedestrian traffic. The game's fights and set pieces throw more at you than ever before. They cover greater areas than ever before, and ultimately, that does make them more fun than ever before. There's ray-traced reflections everywhere. Windows and cars, of course, metallic or glossy parts of the Spider-Man suits, naturally, but also on the river, on varnished floors, on balloons, on eyeballs probably. There's copious amounts of it, and not just clean, perfect mirror reflections, but diffused on technically challenging, rough materials too. I'd be lying if I said that the reflections changed up the gameplay in any way, but as a sheer flex from Insomniac, striking. Graphically, the game is exceptional in motion. It packs in a lot of detail considering the scale, and it's all subtly saturated and stylized to suit the comic source material. It's not flawless, of course. You'll find the odd low-res texture, overall texture filtering could be better, and you have to make a hard choice to compromise on frame rate or visual fidelity. I'm not going to dive into the differences between profiles in this review, but I will just say that personally I'd recommend the 40 frames per second mode if you have a TV that supports it, but all the footage in this video was taken at 30, which is a good way to play. The cutscenes aren't a total knockout, and it's hard to put my finger on why, as the character models and motion capture seem to be really high quality, but something about the stylized presentation holds it back when people are unmasked. They all look great in costume, but as normal humans, they don't quite match up to the industry's best. And it's all undermined a little bit by anti-aliasing that struggles with fine lines, so there's a slightly distracting flaw that manifests on hair and eyelashes. That's just me being really picky though. Overall, Insomniac achieved great things with graphics in this game. It's right up there with the best of the PlayStation 5, and even leading the pack in some regards. Insomniac also fully embraced the DualSense controller, though that's not always for the best. Feeling the tension of a web pull through the triggers is fine, but minigames centered around controller gimmicks should probably be reserved for Astro's Playroom. Spider-Man has a few too many of those for my taste. The last signature feature to consider is Tempest Audio. Sony's spatial 3D surround sound is typically well utilized in all of their games, and Spider-Man 2 is no exception. The tech underpins an accomplished soundtrack and effects and top quality voice acting throughout. The only real flaw in the audio is the repetition of certain voice lines and quips, which is a symptom of a wider issue in the game's side content, more so than a problem with the audio itself. The Spider-Man games feature two fundamental systems that work exceptionally well: combat and traversal. I'll get into each of those, but first I want to address the opening sequence of the game. In fact, you could apply this to 2018 as well as Spider-Man 2. They start with bombastic set pieces that give you some semblance of control, but only just. You're tightly restricted in the actions that you can take, and you're often prompted with exactly what buttons to press. It's limiting, but the stuff that unfolds on screen is spectacular. I hated those sections. I nearly walked away from the first Spider-Man before it even got going. In hindsight, that would have been a terrible error on my part, because it isn't at all representative of how the game plays out. These sections make a lot of sense if you consider them wildly stylish, overly excitable tutorials. The button prompts and the actions broadly align with the freeform controls that the game offers up when it gets going. And get going it does. Most of the game is freeform, so don't let the intro put you off. There's actually a lot of complexity to the controls that you have at your fingertips in Spider-Man 2, a lot of options available at every moment, and yet it feels simple in action. I separate out the combat and traversal systems as distinct from each other, but those systems are always at your fingertips. Switching up between web swinging and fighting feels so intuitive that you almost forget that that complexity is there. That's a testament to Insomniac's skills in their craft. Spider-Man's controls are clearly defined, but every action is also context sensitive, adapted on the fly to suit the situation. Example, the circle button is clearly defined as dodge. You know that it's dodge, but it's not going to roll you in a particular direction. It's a context sensitive dodge, reactive to whatever threat is incoming and aware of your environment. It's intuitive, effective, and satisfying to use. But if you prefer, you could look at a nearby ledge, press both triggers, and web zip away, swing about for a bit, web pull an enemy up to your level, and then come crashing back down into the fight. The game does a lot for you, but you do have control. You feel in control. Almost every action has this context-sensitive intelligence at play, and it treads a fine line. It could so easily feel like the game wrests control away from you if the intelligent action doesn't match the player's intent. But Insomniac walk that line so competently and so elegantly that it just makes you feel like you're really good at Spider-Man-ing. It all plays out with such fluidity and just casually splices in cinematic camera work as it goes. The combat looks and feels great. Unless you choose to spam all of your gadgets and special moves all at once. You can end some encounters before they even get going if you do that, but I guess options are good. The excellent combat is built on the same fundamental systems as the prior Spider-Man games, those of course rooted in Rocksteady's Arkham games, and the refinements over Miles Morales are fairly minor. Peter's speed and moveset has been brought up to the standard of that most recent take. He's faster and more responsive than he was before, in line with Miles, but still visually distinct. The only notable addition to combat really is the ability to parry with L1. Parry has a slightly higher risk-reward payoff than dodging, and there are occasions that mandate its use. The parry fits into the flow of combat alright, but it's ultimately not transformative, but then the combat didn't really need transforming. The other system that Insomniac previously mastered is traversal, web swinging across New York. This is another system that really wasn't calling for any transformative changes, but it does receive a change that you might say fits that billing: wingsuits. You get twice as much New York to swing through, and even with significantly faster swing speeds, Insomniac must have felt that swinging those increased distances got tedious, and perhaps it didn't work so well when it came to crossing the large river that splits the map in two. Their answer is that the spider people can deploy their little wings and glide. For the first few hours of the game, I really didn't enjoy the wings. They felt clumsy, but that wasn't the whole issue. I liked launching Spidey into the city, web swinging and point launching my way around, and the wings undermined that. By the end of the game, I'd made my peace with the wings, and I used them alongside the old ways. Gliding relies on and depletes your momentum, and while the city features a network of wind tunnels that you can leverage to travel quickly, I found my fun launching into the wingsuit and shifting between webs and wings to maximize momentum, and still find the simple act of getting from one place to another to be really fun. But you do unlock fast travel district by district, so you can circumvent a lot of traveling if you don't enjoy it like I did. Speaking of unlocking, Spider-Man 2 obviously features light RPG elements because most games do. Very light in this case. Peter and Miles level up and they earn skill points. They collect tech parts to upgrade various abilities and gadgets. Those resources are shared. You don't grind for Peter and Miles independently. And ultimately, you'll have everything unlocked well before completion of the game. So it's about prioritizing what you want to learn first, rather than making build-defining choices. I'm not really saying that as a negative. Not every game needs to be an RPG. This next bit though, these are negative. Science mini-games, DualSense mini-games, secondary characters on stealth missions, Peter Parker on a bicycle. The Spider-Man experience is quite an adrenaline rush, so Insomniac sprinkle in little moments of respite. They slow things down to let you catch your breath, and these moments are all too often terrible. Fortunately, they're also easy, so you can push through to the other side and get back to having fun fairly quickly, but still, there has to be a better way than Peter on a bicycle. I'm not really a comic book guy. My exposure to Spider-Man comes entirely from films and games, but that's enough to make the characters and themes very familiar. Spider-Man 2018 played with those familiar characters and themes, but it caught me off guard with the quality of its portrayal, the depth and maturity in the story, the emotion on display from the actors. It was a cut above Hollywood's telling, and not just of Spider-Man, but the majority of superhero flicks. Miles Morales was less familiar to me. I only really know that character from the Spider-Verse films and from these games. His more streamlined, expand-alone story flew by and established him well. It hinted at his own world of relationships, antagonists, and stories ripe to be told. This time around, it's supposedly about both the Spider-Mans, Peter Parker and Miles Morales. I say supposedly about both. In practical terms, you probably split your time between those characters quite evenly. I haven't measured that, but it feels true enough. But I don't feel that the weight of the story was split so evenly. Spider-Man 2 is very much centered on Peter Parker and the characters that surround him. A return to the familiar. Poor Miles spends a lot of his time trying to inherit the relationships and tensions that aren't really his, and he pushes on through the story as something of a Mary Sue, too pure and wholesome to be very compelling. I think Miles can be every bit as interesting as Peter, and probably more so, but he's relegated to second fiddle here, and using it strictly for one note, yet taking up half of the time on the screen. Half is not strictly true, or at least not mathematically accurate, because the campaign does insist that you play as several tertiary characters along the way. Spider-Man 2018 was fairly notorious for its awful non-Spidey stealth missions. Those are back. They're significantly improved this time, but still a low point, and they get progressively ever more ridiculous. There are a few other slowed down moments that are supposed to provide exposition and change up the pacing. They may even be effective in that, kind of acting as preparation for the main course, but they do drag sometimes. Not to the extremes of God of War Ragnarok's Ironwood or anything crazy like that. Fortunately, when the main course is served and the story moves, it is once again exceptional. Yes, a lot of it is familiar even to this casual Spidey observer, but it's clear that Insomniac have their own vision and they're trusted by Marvel to tell it. Their version of every antagonist is so consistently excellent, and the cinematic cutscenes and set pieces so well directed. This really is another awesome entry. For me, it doesn't quite live up to 2018 or even to Miles Morales, but that doesn't mean that it disappoints. One area of Spider-Man that I'd like to see improved is the sense of humour. The hero known for quick-witted quips rarely even attempts to be funny and never succeeds. I've praised the story of all three games, and I don't want Insomniac to shift the tone completely and stop taking themselves seriously, but there's definitely room for better jokes without ruining the bits that are done well. Spider-Man games take place in New York City, and it's presented as an open world, or open city I suppose, that the Spider-Mens can patrol and engage with freely between campaign missions. To be blunt, the structure and quality of side content is something Insomniac have struggled with in the past and continue to struggle with here. It's weird because the city is well realised, the simple act of traversing around it is fun, the combat is fun. You'd think that the pieces are in place to provide content that's fun. And you'd be right, there is fun to be had, but there's significant problems. I think the challenge that Insomniac have is figuring out how to make the player engage with the city organically. You whiz around skyscrapers so fast that you never really take in the finer detail of the world or its inhabitants. There's not much opportunity to draw the player into compelling scenarios in a natural way. Everything relies on map markers and beacons, and those quickly pile up to feel quite checklisty. As you play, you can see that a lot of care and attention goes into those checklists. There's a lot of fan service of the non-sexy kind, but checklists still ultimately feel like chores. This game has a lot of chores, and you'll put yourself through completing most of them just because they're within reach, but you'll probably moan about them like I do. As you knock off your chores, you're rewarded with some meaningful character developments, so there is decent incentive to push through, but there's very little joy in it. There are a couple of properly fleshed out side missions, in particular a chain that follows some fire cultists, and another that centres on a museum for musical history. These stand out as beacons of quality amongst the padding, but these bespoke missions are clearly more expensive to produce, and there aren't very many. At the opposite end of the spectrum are the dynamic events, spontaneous crimes that erupt one at a time across the city within about 500 meters of whichever Spider-Man you are. Within the first 3 hours of the game, I think I'd stopped a dozen speeding cars, all with the exact same QuickTime event finish and all the same small pool of voice lines. The diversity of events increases as the game goes on. They keep layering on new events and new types, but they never stop feeling repetitive. And interspersed with the checklist content, it all becomes quite overbearing, even irritating. I also want to single out some missions that Miles undertakes around his college campus, a series of quests so bad that I lost a part of my soul that I can never recover. Miles, as the masked superhero vigilante Spider-Man, helping students ask each other on dates and complete their course assignments. This content is bemusingly awful. Fortunately, it is quite brief, but still. I'd rather have more Pete on a bicycle time, and that is saying something. Spider-Man 2 launched at 70 monies, which is more or less the top-end price point for games. Apparently, I played it for 43 hours. That number is a bit padded out from recording and such, but I'd say there's about 30 to 40 hours of game here, and obviously less if you don't want to consume all of the padding. You can replay it on harder difficulties, and a New Game Plus mode is supposed to be patched in soon, but there's no room for deviation in how the story plays out. No reason to play it again apart from as an expression of love. There's also no microtransactions. And with tons of cosmetics, there was definitely an opportunity to put microtransactions in there. So I respect Sony and Insomniac for keeping it pure in that regard. I did encounter a few bugs on my playthrough. I had one hard crash, one getaway car that clipped through a building, and I had the audio transcript of a phone call between Peter and MJ play out while I was controlling Miles. A handful of instances of NPCs casually standing in weird places, on top of a tree or the bonnet of a car. I mostly played within the rules and followed expectations. I wasn't playing in a particularly chaotic way, so I'm sure you could break it more if you want to, but overall I'd say it's a pretty well polished release. So what is it worth? That's obviously up to you. I'm just telling you what you get in the package, or at least my experience of it. Spider-Man 2 really challenges the way that I assess games. It hits incredible peaks in quality. It hits those peaks quite frequently, and the good parts of the game are the most meaningful to the experience that I had with it. They dictate my affection for the game, and I must say I really liked it. But if I reflect on the game in totality, those peaks don't actually represent the majority of the time that I spent playing. I think it's pretty difficult to hook a player into a compelling open world where they zoom over the surface at 1,000,000 miles per hour, but it being difficult doesn't really mitigate that it's a challenge Insomniac failed to meet. Too much of my time with Spider-Man 2 was spent on things that I didn't actually enjoy. My scoring system goes some way to providing context beyond a number, but there's no easy way to condense my thoughts down into a meaningful bite that conveys just how good the game is when it peaks, whilst also acknowledging those flaws. Still, scores do serve a purpose, so I press on and hope that the context isn't lost. There's no doubt in my mind that Spider-Man gets an A for its scope and ambition. Even as a more of the same kind of sequel, Insomniac strive to be top of the pile in gameplay, tech and storytelling with exceptional production value. The number that I give is an indicator of how well they executed on their ambitions, and I give a lot of weight and respect for the stuff that they got right. But the flaws in this game aren't things that I can ignore or dismiss. They're often front and center in the game, so on balance, I'm giving this an 80 for execution. So, A80, with a really strong recommendation from me, because the peaks of this game are entirely worth experiencing when you can. Oh, and a small footnote, if you haven't played Spider-Man 2018 or Miles Morales, then I would say that you should play those first. That's my review for Spider-Man 2. I'd love to know what you think of it, so please do comment, and if you like the review then hit subscribe as there's plenty more to come. Thanks.